Speaker, Deputy Speaker, staff of the Parliament building, to welcome all of you to this seminar that has been organized by the Women and Gender Equality Commission, as well as the University of Guyana and CEDAW. As you know, we've had one session already on Tuesday in which we looked at the issue of the auditing mechanisms and, sorry, beg your pardon, I have my document here. It's gender legislation, sorry, yes. And we've had some very, I would say, powerful presentations that were made by the panelists here. And as you know, it is a seminar that is intended to, a 3-day seminar, but it will not be done in 3 days per se, but on several different occasions. So we've had one on Tuesday, and we're having the other one today. And we will also be having the final one, which will be on March 16, on Wednesday, March 16. And if you look within your files, you will see the issues that will be raised. So on behalf of the parliamentarians here today, it is indeed a pleasure to welcome all of you to this seminar. We have tied the seminar up with our social sector meeting because, as you know, it is a critical time right now for us as members of Parliament, because we're in the process of a local government election that will be held next Friday, and everybody, you know, they're out there doing all the work that they can possibly do in their areas of responsibility. So we have 3 panelists, and we have our chairperson, and I would like to once again thank all of you for taking time out to be here. This is something new for us in the Parliament, in terms of that we're literally having a seminar on gender here, and then we have experts who have come from afar, and our chairperson will be sharing those information with you. And I'm happy that so much of my colleagues from the Parliament are here, ministers as well, so I can say today is a much better day than the first day. So, Madam Chair, I just want to pass the phone over to you, and you can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chantal. Honorable members of the House, members of the panel, NGOs, friends, members of the media. Special welcome to each and every one of you to this second session here today. And I know it's going to be very, very lively and interactive. And I ask that we get our phones on silent, because it's going to disrupt the session. Today we have, before I begin the session, for the benefit of the panelists, could we quickly introduce ourselves, say who we are and where we're from, just very brief, so that we can know each other, and the panelists also can know who they are within the audience. Thank you very much, and so I'd like us to start from my left.
Indra Chandpal, Member of Parliament and Chairperson of the Women and Gender Equality Commission. Thank you.
Aniki Elias, Personal Assistant to the Minister within the Ministry of Social Protection.
Joseph Hamilton, Member of Parliament.
Peter Passat from the Women and Gender Equality Commission.
Sheila Verasamy, Member of Parliament.
Keen Chase, Project Officer, Childing.
Nicole Cole, Commissioner on the Women and Gender Equality Commission, and also Commissioner on the Rights of the Child Commission, representing the Women and Gender Equality Commission. I thank you.
Renata Jefferson, Commissioner, represent the private sector on the Women and Gender Equality Commission.
Ruth Benjamin, retired nurse, West Mineral Regional Hospital.
Occupational Safety and Health Officer.
Karen D'Souza from Redford.
Johnny Marcos, Redford.
Janita Rancic, Health and Shelter.
Shima Patrick, Advocacy and Communications Officer and Leader of Women and Gender and the Society Against Sexual Orientation and Discrimination Standard.
Joel Adams, Member of Parliament.
Dr. Karen Cummings, Minister within the Ministry of Public Health.
Valerie Garrido, Minister within the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs.
Valerie Adams Patterson, Ministry within the Ministry of Communities with responsibility for hosting.
Carla Isaacs, Researcher, Parliament Office.
Shirley Varden, Clerk.
Michelle Chong, Researcher, Parliament Office.
Marissa Dodson, Assistant Clerk Committees, Parliament Office.
Jessica Small, Assistant Clerk of Committees, Parliament Office.
Asif Khan, student of the University of Guyana and here representing the Guyana Society for the Blind.
And Sandra Hooper, Rights of the Child Commission and also a member of the Women and Gender Commission representing Rights of the Child.
I'm here, head of the Fund for Local Initiatives, and secondarily as a member of the United Women for Special Children.
Women and Gender Equality Commission. And Renata needs to introduce herself.
I did.
She did. And yours truly, Hamati Lagan, Administrator of the Women's Affairs Bureau, Ministry of Social Protection. And along with us, we have Ms. Aisha Fritz, who's the rapporteur for the session, and she will be taking very key notes from the session, as she did in the previous sessions. So let me begin the session here. Like we know, it's stated on your sheet that these seminars are sponsored by the Women and Gender Equality Commission in partnership with the University of Guyana Institute for Gender Studies, with support from the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, CFLI. Three illustrious women at the head table, and I know we're going to have quite a lot here today. And so, to begin the session, we have Ms. Christine Ara, representative of the UNWomen Caribbean Country Cluster. And just briefly on Christine Ara, prior to her appointment as UNWomen representative and head of the Multicultural Office Caribbean, Christine Ara from Canada was the chief of the Asian Pacific section at the UNWomen headquarters. Ms. Arab took up the post of Chief of AP after completing a special assignment as an advisory within the UNWomen transition team during the establishment of the new UN entity. I now bring to the podium Ms. Christine Arab.
Thank you. Thank you all. Vice Chancellor, members of the House, NGOs, activists, colleagues, students. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on such an illustrious panel. As UN official, I always feel that I've cheated my way on as opposed to the others who have great brains, which we will hear from shortly. I wasn't entirely sure what to present, and so you'll forgive me. I brought together a few things, not quite clear on exactly what you would like to have from me in terms of more on sustainable development goals and the gender components, more on how it's being interpreted in the Caribbean to date, or more on the issue of women in leadership, because we just finished a perception survey in 4 countries, including Guyana, on people's perception of women in leadership, which of course is a key aspect. But I think I will stick to start with on sustainable development goals, just giving you the overview. And if there's time and interest later, I can certainly give you a summary of the findings of the perception survey in the 4 countries around women in leadership. The Sustainable Development Goals are next to the Declaration, the Charter of Human Rights, probably the single greatest ambitious agenda that the United Nations has put forward. In this presentation, when I say United Nations, I don't mean the UN agencies you normally deal with. I mean the member states, 193 member states, including all of CARICOM, have signed off on these. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, also called the Post-2015 Agenda, also called Agenda 2030. They are often referred to as a replacement of the Millennium Development Goals, but they are actually much more than that. And one of the challenges that the system now, the development agencies have faced, is that much of the negotiation around the SDGs was owned by governments entirely. But when we say governments, it was largely ministries of foreign affairs or ministries of sustainable development. So in a number of the cabinets we're speaking to around the region, a number of ministries that have huge obligations under the Sustainable Development Goals have not been given an opportunity to wrap their heads around what it means for their ministry, their remit, how this is to be interpreted. In essence, the Millennium Development Goals, there were significant achievements, but what we learned very early on in all of the governments reporting against these is that those in the margins were still being left behind. A colleague of mine quite cleverly said, at the end of the Millennium Development Goals, which really did result in a significant drop in poverty, we had probably fewer poor countries, but not necessarily fewer poor people. An ultimate essence of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. It is a bringing together, no, if you can stay on the first, who am I speaking to? You can stay on the first one, thank you. It's a bringing together of what has typically been called sustainable development, disaster risk resilience, climate change, eco-friendly practices, all of those many issue areas which I am not an expert on, with the idea of the more typical development, social economic development, good governance, human rights. Why are they separate? They need to be integrated. What you ended up with is 17 goals, which, and this was entirely negotiated by the member states, and they loosely fall. I'm not going to read them all, but you see them. It's poverty, hunger, healthy lives, education, water, energy, inclusive and economic growth, resilient infrastructure. Next slide. Inequality within and among countries, goal 10, that's massive. Reduce inequality within and among countries. Cities and human settlements, sustainable consumption, urgent action climate change, use of ocean seas, sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, promote peaceful and inclusive societies, and then the last one, which you can't see, and escapes me, number 17, sorry. But they are all focused in every, if you were to break down the indicators, the targets and the indicators, which the indicators are going to be officially adopted in another 3 weeks, it's inclusive. The lead up to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals was enormous. There was national level dialogues around the world, there were regional level dialogues, because at the same time, and more relevant for the Caribbean region, was the Small Island Developing States normative framework also being discussed. Now that is now called the Samoa Pathway. It was adopted in Samoa. Guyana played a key role and also raised the message repeatedly that the SIDS agenda is also about low-lying states, not just small island states. UNWomen helped over the past 4 years now a joint position that governments and NGOs have been using to ensure that the Caribbean perspective on the post-2015 agenda and on the SIDS agenda was not lost from a gender perspective. And that, it was called the Caribbean Joint Statement. Now that broke down into 4 main areas: ending violence against women, the issue of capabilities, that your laws in the Caribbean don't actively discriminate based on sex, but they remain gender neutral, which actually can be gender blind. So if I don't have equitable access to capabilities, health, food, education, food insecurity, I can't advance despite what the laws allow. Economic empowerment, which had a strong and detailed focus on the fact that these are middle-income countries, highly indebted, no debt relief, in a very small fiscal window, but being asked to do a myriad of things, and leadership. Next slide. I won't get into the Samoa pathway except to say that when the SIDS normative agenda was adopted about a year, almost a year exactly, before the SDGs, it folded for one of the first times strongly the gender equality issues. The Secretary General of the UN has made clear, and every result and assessment we've done of the MDGs has made clear, in those countries that did not advance comprehensively on the MDGs, they had a very poor track record on gender equality. And the Secretary General and member states in adopting the Samoa pathway and subsequently the SDGs made that very clear in, if you do not have substantive equality between the sexes, you are not going to be able to achieve the majority of the targets and goals set. A couple key points about the SDGs that is very different from the MDGs. They apply to all 193 member states. One of the problems with the MDGs is it was the North instructing the South. The people that pay for things instructing the recipients, as it were. That's no longer the case, and that was one of the complex parts of negotiations around the SDGs, is that equally applies to everyone and all member states. And as you know, the issues of climate change and the Paris Agreement that was reached a few months ago, it is actually the wealthier states on the planet that can be the more contentious part of that dialogue. So this was a very challenging. It means that all member states have to report against this. And that in and of itself is also very challenging because there's not a single country on the planet that has achieved substantive gender equality, and that includes the Scandinavian countries. The next slide. So what is in the SDGs in terms of gender equality? It is generally ending all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere, and that is then further defined as public and private, violence against women, public and private, elimination of all harmful practices, unpaid care work, women's full and effective participation, and this last point, ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health. I won't read that all. That language and that last point was one of the most contentious parts of all 17 SDGs. Because that language is the language of 1995 under the International Convention on Population and Development and under the Beijing Platform for Action, which does not allow this statement to go beyond health. It stays at health. It does not get into the issue as we would have liked to have seen in rights. But at least it didn't go backwards, which was also a fight, and I need to be very clear. In the negotiations of the SDGs, it wasn't even just should we stick at a language of 20 years ago, but there were a number of member states who wanted to reduce that language further. Next slide. The targets address issues of women's equal rights to economic resources, enabling technologies, and sound policy enforceable legislation. Next slide. You can't read that. It's been mainstream throughout a number of the goals, and I would just highlight the ones around poverty and hunger, healthy living, education, and reducing inequality between and among countries, as well as human settlements, cities and human settlements, and around peaceful resolution. Goal 17 was very focused. I see this now, and it reminds me, and forgive me, but there are 17 of them in my defense, so it's a bit hard to keep it all in line. Goal 17 is very much about accountability towards the 16 other goals, and that includes data. Next slide. I'll stop the slides for now and just delve a bit more. Next week, the Commission on the Status of Women convenes. This is the 60th Commission. It's very focused now on how do you implement the SDGs. It's not going to reopen the SDGs in any way. Now for the Caribbean and for all of the Americas, what's really key in terms of implementing the SDGs is clear accountability and the ability to hold governments and decision makers to account. Are the legal frameworks up to date to meet the SDGs? Are the institutions that are meant to support the legal frameworks well positioned, well aligned, given proper resource and remit to do so? And partnerships. Now here's a really important key message to take on partnerships. One of the dialogues that came through over and over on the SDGs is the fact that about 1% of the world owns what percentage of the world's wealth, and that 1% rests largely in private sector. Yet they're not part of the dialogue and negotiations around the SDGs. However, you're not going to achieve any of the SDGs if the private sector are not seriously engaged. And this isn't just about money. This is about corporate commitments to do A, B, C, D, E, F. You have the Women's Empowerment Principles, which are a global process that a number of multinational corporations and national corporations have signed off on that commit both within their workforce, but also with recognition that we are a significant player in the community, therefore we must commit. I think what's come out of the regional dialogues and the global dialogue that will happen next week is that you cannot approach partnerships in a typical way. Since Beijing, frankly, we have seen an increasing polarization worldwide between civil society and governments. In the Caribbean, thankfully, it is not a region that governments actively prosecute NGOs, nor vice versa. But you do see through reduction of subventions, through reduction of access to dialogue, through just simply not being able to access members of parliament and government officials in a number of countries in the Caribbean in the way you once did, that in absolutely essential partnership, everyone's still doing their business, they're just maybe not doing their business as closely together as could be effective. I'm not an expert on Guyana, so I don't know if that's the case for Guyana, but we're certainly hearing it in a number of the countries where we are more active. I think if I was to stop now, because I suspect I'm well overdue, I would just highlight a few points. CARICOM doesn't have data. You don't have data. You don't have data that matches the high capacity of your ministries and governments. I mean, it is a singularity, if I can say, in the Caribbean that you have solid good governance, a long history of solid institutions, solid civil service, and you can pick any sector you want, and the data is still not up to par with your neighbors in South America. Now, when you bring on the gender lens, that is amplified tenfold. Almost all gender-based statistics that you reference are either issued by NGOs, which is good and can be quite solid, but unfortunately governments don't tend to rely and make policy decisions based on NGO-issued data or academia. Or they are coming from international organizations like mine, which can measure apples and oranges. And I will give you an example because many of the women in this room are familiar with the UNODC report of 2007, from which you get the same repeated statement that the Caribbean has some of the highest rates of sexual violence in the world. None of us are actually in a position to say if that's true or not, because that same listing says that Saudi Arabia has no cases of sexual violence. So you are measuring apples and oranges in that. Now, it could well be true. And there, to be clear, is no question that the rates of gender-based violence in the Caribbean, given that it is not a post-conflict region, is off the charts. But you're not in a position, as governments, as members of parliaments, to make informed decisions because of that absence of data. That means holding to account in the absence of data how policy is working, how policy needs to be triggered or changed because of the SDGs or broader national issues is very challenging. A lot of assumptions are made. Assumptions based on what your constituents and all constituents say or don't say, or what you hear or you don't. And that's a very uneasy position and an unenviable position to be in. We are supporting CARICOM. We have agreed that all of the statistical offices in CARICOM have agreed to a set of gender equality indicators based on the global norm. Phase 1 is now being rolled out. And the point is that the majority of these indicators, the data exists in countries. In all of your countries, it's just not been analyzed. The main gap is violence, and to that end, we have supported CARICOM in adopting a household survey to assess prevalence of violence. We're rolling it out in at least 4 to 5 countries in the next 2 years in partnership with IDB, in partnership with CDB and others. We would dearly love to be in partnership with the Canadians and others to roll it out in Guyana so that you have actual viable data on the nature of the violence and how people are responding, what the services are responding, so you can make the informed decisions you want. You know, we had I'll stop here to say that our logo and slogan is Step It Up, 50-50 by 2030. And that means a real tasted, lived equality for everyone by 2030. It's a very ambitious agenda. We mobilized over 90 heads of state to commit to this when the SDGs were adopted last year. And from CARICOM, only one head of state came, but thankfully it was yours. And President Granger made an impassioned declaration of the advancements made so far and what he wants to see happen for his country in the future. And we were so proud as UNWomen in the Caribbean to have such a strong leader come forward when, you know, Brazil and Mexico in our region are always saying A, B, and C, and there we had CARICOM there with a brilliant voice. And I want to, on behalf of UNWomen, commend you for that and thank you for that. And we stand ready to help you in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Christine Arab. And so we move to our second presenter, who is Dr. Linda Peake. And just give you a little on Dr. Linda Peake, graduated from the Reading University, UK with an undergraduate degree in PhD in geography. Since completing her PhD in 1983, she has taught at universities in England, the United States, Canada, and Guyana. Dr. Peake has been conducting research in Guyana for nearly 3 decades, working with the Guyanese Women's Organization, Red Thread, on topics ranging through the impact of structural adjustment on women and households, domestic violence, women's reproductive health, sex work, trafficking, young adults' sexualities, and most recently, urban insecurities in Georgetown, the capital city. Most recently, she has taken up the position of Director of the City Institute in Europe. I now welcome Dr. Linda Peake to the microphone.
Thank you, everybody. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, apologies, but I do have a handout. It's like going back to the 1980s. So could I pass these around? I'd like to start by thanking Vanda for inviting me to give this presentation today. It's really an honour and a privilege. As was mentioned, I've been conducting research in Guyana for over 3 decades now, along with Red Thread. And at the same time, I'm the director of the City Institute at York University in Toronto. So today I'm going to be talking about that interrelationship between women and cities, which unfortunately is not necessarily a very obvious one for many people. And in the 21st century, we've been told that we've never had it so good. Just think of what we've achieved. The facts are quite staggering. We've put men on the moon, we've developed the internet, we've increased GDP and NDP, we're reducing poverty, and yet we still can't change the sexual division of labour. And in far too many places, gender relations are still very far from